Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, legal eagles, luminaries, and learners. Welcome from Oxford. My name is Zubair Abbasi, and today we will discuss an important topic. 15th August 2021 was a historical moment when, to the surprise of the whole world, Taliban took over Kabul. Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, and evacuation of US soldiers and diplomatic members of US and other embassies and Afghan nationals who want to leave the country has been catching uh, the headlines all over the world. In this context, we wanted to bring you different perspectives about the Taliban's their views about political governance, their religious views. There is lots of concern about Taliban's perspective of Sharia and protection of women and minorities' rights. Today, we are joined by uh, numerous scholars who are at the top of their academic careers, and they have been contributing in this area of research. We will start with Professor Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, who was Vice Chancellor of Sargodha University and a Quaid-e-Azam Fellow at Oxford University. So over to you, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Zubair Abbasi. It's a great opportunity to be part of this August panel organized by Global Institute of Law. I did my PhD in 1996, but before that, I was a career journalist. And in that capacity, I reported the conflict in Swat in Pakistan. But before that, I had the opportunity of covering the rise of Taliban in Afghanistan. So as you know, that if you have spent a few years focusing on a conflict, so that stays in your mind. And I think anything in addition to what my colleagues will be saying is based upon my own humble understanding of the Taliban movement. In that process, basically my first report in early 95 was titled, "Who are Taliban?" And then I wrote some analysis, back from Kandahar to Quetta. And from there, I just spent a week or so. During that time, I met Mullah Omar by chance. I met Mullah Mansoor, and I spent some time inside the Taliban headquarters, which was the old governor house in Kandahar city. And people like Amir Mottaki, who became the information minister last time, and he's still, I think somewhere in the leadership council. Many of others whom we met died in the last 20 plus years. So one thing is that the Taliban rose out of vacuum, which was left because of the anti-Soviet jihad and infighting among the Mujahideen. And that vacuum, because there was lawlessness, there was, armed gangs and Mujahideen, they used to call it Topakan. So because of that, there was a reaction, spontaneous reaction. However, as the Taliban movement gained momentum, obviously, in order to reach Kabul, they signed, unholy pacts with warlords like Mullah Rockety. I remember inside the Taliban headquarters, I saw Mullah Omar receiving a delegation by Mullah Rockety, who brought along his brother, who had kidnapped the deputy commissioner of Quetta city and 3 Chinese engineers some months ago. And there was, ransom. There was a deal struck with the Pakistani government at that time. So these were thugs, who collaborated with the Taliban, and eventually this force comes to power. And then comes the second part that, okay, we can accept the fact that, it was a natural response to infighting. But once these guys came into power and became a little bit more, confident of their rule, then obviously the fact that we saw right in the beginning that the entire force, as far as I remember, from the Chaman border spin ball, that was going from Pakistani madrasas, as simple as that. And there was the same kind of excitement about Taliban as a rising power, as we see, unfortunately, among the middle class today in Pakistan as well. So Pakistan had a hand in the rise of Taliban movement because Pakistan wanted, like since early 90s, wanted to reach, this dream of reaching out to Central Asian republics, Muslim and all that. Now, once they were established, then we can fast forward to say the time when first time Taliban tried to capture Mazar-e-Sharif. I remember our ambassador, the then ambassador to Afghanistan, Aziz Khan, who later served as High Commissioner in India as well. He led a delegation on a C-130 plane to Mazar-e-Sharif, and once they went there, they tried to guide the Taliban leadership not to disarm the Uzbek militia. And the leader of the Taliban, who was next day killed in a revolt by the Uzbek militia, because that revolt actually killed around 2,000 Taliban, it is estimated, because the entire city was captured and then retaken in a matter of 3 days. So once Ambassador Aziz comes back in the evening, we meet him in the evening, and he tells us that, those guys were asking us that who the hell you are, coming all the way to Afghanistan and telling us, don't do this, don't do this. You go back and introduce real Islam. So fast forward to 2021, what has happened is right before our eyes. This entire American project of whatever state building or nation building fizzled out. It was a facade. It lacked commitment. And then if you go by the figures, only they say this American watchdog, its latest reported 3 weeks ago, that only perhaps 2%, less than 2% of money that the Americans invested in Afghanistan, close to $1 trillion, was spent in the, like in on say maybe on the development of the Afghan people. So this facade, it is over. Second is that for the first time, barring Panjshir Valley, the Taliban have controlled, the rest of Afghanistan. For now, these assurances of inclusive government, there are Taliban who are really on a charm offensive. You got guys, young people speaking fluent English, very impressive. And there are all sorts of, like offers on the table from their part. But, or perhaps, like things may turn out to be different this time. But what I believe is that Taliban draw their legitimacy from their ideological purity. So whatever they are claiming right now, in order to ensure that they remain a little bit moderate in their political expression or social expression in future as part of the regime, we have to have some kind of an international regime, whether it's a collection of regional states and regional powers, that disincentivizes Taliban from pursuing, the same kind of order, state order, as they did back in the 90s up till 2001. Remember, this time they have come back to power in a much more vicious manner. The guys who actually betrayed, there are many levels of betrayal. If just the concluding remarks, there are many levels of betrayal. Ask President Ashraf Ghani, who betrayed him and in which circumstances he had to flee. Because we have these old folks like Hikmat Yar. I have a book on Hikmat Yar, and I know what he has been doing since the days of the Kabul University. You have Abdullah. You have this old fox, Hamid Karzai. I think, things will come out in future as to where the compromises were made. Where did the CIA betray the wider American global Western cause in Afghanistan? What kind of deals were made? Situation is still so fluid. that the space for informed, dialogue and understanding is still limited. But I, based upon my own humble understanding of what took place in the run-up to the Kabul's fall, and during the course of the Taliban regime, it is a part of history. And I think it's a religious movement. The leadership was very clear at that time that they subscribe to a Hanafi form of Sunni, rule in Afghanistan, which is what they tried to implement during the last time. And I don't think that, 20 years down the lane, the Sharia, as they perceive it to be, has been modified in the process. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed. Now we will request Dr. Muhammad Talib to provide his perspective. Dr. Talib teaches anthropology at Oxford University.
Thank you very much, Zubair, and the Global Institute of Law for this panel discussion, for organizing this panel discussion. And I'm very pleased to see Ishtiaq Saab after a long, long time. And Harun, thank you. It's an opportunity to interact with you. And Professor Sherwani, whom I thought I met you somewhere, but anyway, you were such a familiar face and such a familiar way of talking. I thought I should take a position which is that of an under-laborer, and clarify certain things before perhaps, and to defer this debate on taming Taliban or humanizing imperialism. I remember Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed commenting on the well-known writer on Taliban, Afghanistan and Pakistan, I mean Ahmed Rashid. And Ishtiaq Sahab, you would remember it was a very, I truly admire your the way you handled that when Ahmed Rashid was in the audience. I mean, he was there to comment as well. But the way you presented, and I quite liked that piece, that presentation. And your view was that Ahmed Rashid's scholarly position on Taliban vacillates, and he even self-contradicts with changing strategic considerations of the US and its allies in the Afghan war. So, and also you were able to show how his writings, when they moved from 1990s to the post 9/11 scenario, they were sort of gradually contradicting each other. And I thought this is a perfect, sharp insight in sociology of ideas, where you view ideas in context. And when I also remember when you were referring to Ahmed Rashid's views, talking about Taliban motivation without covering their movement from within, and instead taking sides in the conflict as advisors to the leaders of the state of affairs in Afghanistan, it just struck me that it's not just Ahmed Rashid, but a large number of knowledge producers who are part of the division of labor of the theater of war that consists not only of the high kinetics of soldiers with military wear, but also the willing intellectuals who are engaged in broadcasting the necessity of weapons of mass consensus and elaborating on the dominant viewpoint. So those writings may be placed, these writings may be placed within the broad framework of strategic engagement of the global Olympian actors, needing legitimizing symbols for a strong footprint on a sovereign land without formally occupying it. The scholars become applauders in the theater of war, writing and interpreting on behalf of the dominant. Thus, concerns like Should we talk to the Taliban? What's the difference between Taliban 2001 and 2021? Can we ever entrust the Taliban for ensuring gender justice and human rights? Or variants of this? What should Pakistan or India do or avoid doing in relation to Afghanistan? How to tame the shrew or beautify the beast? I'm just playing with your title. Uh, Now, in such scholarship, a measuring index seems to exist that is used to gauge standards of gender justice, pluralism, democracy, and respect for human rights. Now, in raising these issues, a smart caution is practiced to never bring in the global powers' own record of violations around these indicators in their country or when they are part of the problem in Afghanistan. Now, I'm trying to argue that as scholars, our knowledge of Taliban is heavily mediated through the stereotypical and ideational constructs manufactured in recent strategic literature that scarcely tally with the sum total of the tribal diversity represented in various components of actually existing universe of Afghans and Taliban. Can I also say that in many classified documents I've seen, I mean declassified documents I've seen, and some of that reader, impressive reader on Taliban, the diversity is acknowledged, but any attempt of unity in the midst of that diversity is denigrated. And this is a established tradition of questioning nationalism on grounds of diversity to say that it is simplifying what exists on the ground. So the stereotypical Taliban helps the global powers in Afghanistan to classify people in the domain of rule and exception, depending upon their political side. There are parallels I see between the ways of a stereotype or a stereotypical thinking and that of cluster bombing or drone attack. Both stereotype and military actions scarcely focus on a specific target of attack, and the actual victims of their application, ordinary people, rarely correspond with their imagined enemies, sorry. And lots of reports of collateral violence. This is rounded off as collateral violence, collateral killing or whatever. I really don't understand this vocabulary. So the demonic and the militant Taliban does not refer to some concrete Taliban, but a consequence of the application of the strategic label upon an assumed offender. The so-called insurgents, who are born when the counterinsurgency rules and sanctions are set in place. Very difficult to actually get out of this pall of smokescreen and be seeing things according to what one should be seeing rather than being directed by someone else. Here, the Taliban, in this stereotypical thinking, Taliban are not what they believe, advocate, or practice, but what they are labeled and imputed as. And this thinking has such a loud voice that it is very difficult not to listen to it or to listen to it in a way that is advantageous to a sociological or an anthropological thinking. Now, in this comment, I'm simply trying to salvage the position of a sovereign intellectual. Believe me, it's an imaginary thing. People have talked about it. And long time ago, in 1930, when Karl Mannheim talks about such an intellectual, sovereign intellectual, he was criticized heavily by many intellectuals saying, where is the space where you would land in this real world? So I would say that I would like to burden my intellectual curiosities with however imaginary this notion is, but we have to seriously think about uh, an a sovereign intellectual, an non-embedded scholar who is being urged to step back while holding on a kind of an imaginary Geneva Accord. Sorry, I'm just in my lighter mood at the moment. A kind of an imaginary Geneva Accord in scholarship, pleading for the retreat of real powerful actors present in the analytical intellectual space. Let me elaborate on this. I mean, an intellectual working in the domain of scholarship, I've seen people saluting the dominant in their writings, being either silent about it or being deferential, or there all sorts of textual strategies are used to express, to say that, you know, the dominant is such an important, you can't be saying like this. Talk about international community. I don't know what international community is. Anyway, uh, uh, so this is like finding the mobilized field of force in Afghan society, currently framed in the construct of Taliban, uh, uh, in the plethora of literature produced by strategic and ideological actors in the theater of Afghan war. Can I also say that it's so difficult to read a declassified document? Uh, I had a number of Marshall students who came for their MSc anthropology, uh, and they were placed in all sorts of vocations in the military establishment. And so I asked them, what's this fascination about a classified document becoming declassified? He says, what can I say? One of them replied, uh, it is already available, the information is already available in the public sphere, which is then put in lock and key. So the arrangement, the configuration of those information, the facts, is what becomes strategic, because the purpose is not to intellectually reflect over it. Yes, they are important as well, but they harp more on diversity rather than on crafting a unified notion of a place, people, and the country out of it. Now, what is true of counterinsurgency measures also applies to the partisan scholars' ways, where conceptual tools oftentimes slip into a semblance of, and I'm invoking T. Lawrence's famous phrase, eating soup with knife. I'm adding fork as well, causing lots of mess for what could scarcely be justified on ground of known perspectives in the making of a peaceful, sovereign country for and by its own people, without the monopoly in decision-making vested in the violators of Geneva Accord, promulgated at the end of the Cold War in 1990s. The worst violator of the Geneva Accord was no one else than this group we endearingly call international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Talib. Whenever you talk, you just bring such insights that it just always make me wonder, oh wow, I did not think about it. So that was very, very insightful. Now I would request Harun Rahimi, who's a young scholar, and it's an honor and privilege that we have been interacting with you. Harun, over to you now.
Thank you very much. And obviously honor is mine to be in such a great company. Dr. Abbasi, Dr. Shirwani, Dr. Ishtiyaq Ahmed, and Dr. Talib, they're all giants of their field. So just happy to be with you. I was just mostly listening and taking it in, as you said. Dr. Ahmed was looking at the origin story of Taliban, how the movement came to be and how it transformed the politics of it over time, and his vision of what the future may hold. Dr. Talib was actually pointing out something much deeper, the way the production of knowledge works, and how it is often weaponized. Just frankly, it's weaponized in that it's a weapon in the hands of powerful, and how narratives are being formed, and how intellectuals are often co-conspirators or or just complicit in how we see the world, how we define roles and assign roles to different actors. And I absolutely, just from an Afghan perspective, I agree that some of that was going on in the way that the Taliban, like the way that the events of the past 20 years in Afghanistan unfolded, and a lot of that is to blame for the fast collapse of Afghan state and the fact that the war in Afghanistan could not find a better conclusion a long time ago. But I would like to bring in a kind of a different angle. It's an angle actually Dr. Abbasi and I were chatting earlier offline about, and it's the idea of having an ideological state that states its purpose, states its mission, its as enforcement of Sharia. This charged term that means great deal to different people and has a positive or negative connotation depending on whom you're talking to. In the West, it's become a scarecrow. Just the word Sharia law, it just means, in the minds of many, just means doom and gloom. In the East, where I'm from, it evokes so much strong emotions that often shuts down conversation and debates. When you invoke Sharia or Sharia law, that's the end of the conversation. It often is used by the powerful as a way to crush dissent, close down debates, and justify sometimes the unaccountable political choices they make in the name of making jurisprudential pronouncements, state enforcing Sharia, quote unquote, clarifying Sharia and such. So as a scholar of Islamic law and as a person who's interested in different conception of rule of law in the Western thought and in the Muslim world, I've been thinking about how we should think about the concept of Sharia in the context of a nation state and the world of nation state that we are living in today, an increasingly institutionalized form of power relationships in the world that have emerged over time due to technological transformations, socioeconomic transformations that have unfolded over the past few centuries of the human experience. And I recently wrote an op-ed about this, trying to put my thoughts to paper a little bit, and I would like to explore them here more with these great scholars. My understanding, the way I try to diagnose where the stumbling blocks are in the way Taliban may approach the issues of governance. I often go to this idea that how would you enforce a pluralistic discourse of fiqh, which is what is often meant when they talk about Sharia, because after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there's really no direct access to Sharia. So what we have is the best human approximation of it, which Muslims have often done so, have achieved those approximations through debate, scholarly debate, often very heated, often much more constrained. And they've tried to approximate that. They've come up with a range of possible interpretations, and those interpretations have been stabilized at times. We had canonical texts and canonical doctrines, but at other times, those canonical texts and doctrines have experienced moments of uncertainty. So the fiqh has gone through something that akin to the way the science have evolved. Cohen and other philosophers have talked about revolutionary changes in science, how you have moments of stabilized paradigms where normal science happen, and then you have revolutionary sciences. I think in the fiqh discourse, we can observe similar patterns of stability and then often moments of transformation due to different reasons. So we have that kind of debate, a scholarly debate, fiqh discourse with all of its characteristics. And now we have a nation state, a state that is basically modeled after the Weberian idea of monopolizing power, having the legitimate monopoly of use of force, and seeks to enforce certain rules. How should these states be guided? What should guide the decision of the state in terms of using force, positive and negative force? Positive force in a sense of generating behavior, and negative force in terms of stopping certain unwanted behavior. How should this lively debate relate to the idea of modern nation state? how should the issue of coercion and use of violence by the state in a legitimate way be reconciled with the idea of fiqh being a pluralistic debate about how should a Muslim live their life in order to please Allah or achieve salvation. Looking at history of fiqh and the discourse that unfolded over time, there are many hints that I believe we can explore to understand our kind of intellectual history of how these patterns have, how these relationships have been negotiated over time. Sadly, they are understudied. Sadly, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the institutional power relationships in the Muslim history, in the Muslim civilizations, when it comes to how jurists relate to qadis, which were state functionaries, and how jurists and qadis relate to the rulers and political class. What were the institutional kind of arrangements that define the boundaries of what separates, what defines a legitimate domain of intervention for the state, what was off limit, what was, was any sense of kind of norms that would justify, legitimize state intervention, and what were they, and what were the safeguards against, obviously, in a case of overreaching state or such. I mean, the debates that the scholars we have so far, I think they're not doing enough justice. Obviously, I'm a junior scholar. I am in no place to criticize giant figures, but like we have on one hand, and if you think of a spectrum, Wael Hallaq, who portrays the history of fiqh as this ultra kind of conception of rule of law, where the state is completely constrained by autonomous jurists who were acting as real constraint on the power of ruler, controlling what the ruler could or could not do, an absolute kind of form of perfect form of separation of power, where those charged with adjudication and enforcement of law had no say in what the laws were to be. Law in this case, I mean, rules that guided state actions would be, and rules that kind of constrain and the rules that operationalize powers would be. That is Wael Hallaq's idea. I think it's very idealistic, and it could be, I mean, you can explore some of those themes in Muslim history, but I think it is idealized, and we can debate as to why it is idealized. I think he's coming up with a corrective narrative, trying to explore some of the kind of native understandings of separation of power and rule of law in the Muslim thought, as a way to speak back to the Western discourse, which is a valuable thing. On the other hand, we have some scholarship that is coming out of our Turkish scholars, who are often writing with, if not explicitly, but with the authoritarian kind of unfolding of Turkish state in mind. I'm actually in Istanbul right now, so I have close connections with what's happening here. And they are talking about how over the history of Islamic thought, the rulers and the class of jurists had very close relationships, and often jurists were co-opted by the rulers, and there was a lot more intermeshing of the two classes, and jurisprudential discourse was used as a way to legitimize the power of ruler, and it was a tool of control. Jurists wanted to control thoughts because that's where the threat to their authority and status would come. If people thought differently or argued differently or had different ideas as to how things should be, they were basically have an interest in preserving orthodoxy. And the rulers wanted the orthodoxy, they instrumentalized orthodoxy as a way to control dissent, political dissent. So there was an alignment. The Turkish scholars of Islamic law tell us there was an alignment that was often explored at the cost of critical thinking, free thinking, and innovation, and explore flourishing new thoughts in the Muslim world, which they attribute to the authoritarianism that we experience today. So that's kind of the spectrum. And I believe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And now with the Taliban in power, which would be like the first traditionalist force that would attempt to govern as a nation state, as the dominant force in a nation state, I think those questions are more important than ever for us to explore and see what should be the relationship between power and jurisprudential discourse, what should be the power relationship between state and fiqh, a state, meaning a modern nation state of the powerful state that we are recognized, what should be the relationship between violence, legitimate violence, and fiqh? What is the role of jurists? Is there an autonomous class of scholars? How autonomous they are? What is the role of orthodoxy in all of this? What is the role of debate, free thought, and intra-Islamic debate, or other types of debate? What is the place for political choices to be made popularly by elected officials? Not jurisprudential pronouncement, not jurisprudential preferences, but just political decisions as to what the state should be or should not be doing. So, I mean, just trying to explore those boundaries, and I think it would be extremely important, because now we are living in a ever more institutionalized world, and some of those relationships have to be explicitly defined. And I think some of the tragedies that unfolded with the Taliban, and some of the roots cause of those tragedies can be traced back to the Taliban conception of power and its relationship to Sharia and fiqh, which is the human understanding of Sharia. And it is rooted in a certain traditional understanding of these that are encoded in some of the curricula in madrasas, where this idea of orthodoxy is kept alive. And I think we need to really deconstruct those relationships and go back in history and think about how these ideas relate, and how they should, how we can think of the historical continuity and use the idea of orthodoxy, state, power relationship, and the jurist and fiqh as a way to imagine a nation state where Muslims can actually meaningfully live their lives as Muslims fully, be true to their tradition, to their roots, to their beliefs, because 99% of Afghans are Muslims. They would like to live as Muslims in a nation state, but at the same time have an accountable, representative government that is accountable to the population, can claim legitimacy based on popular support. And so those questions, I think, are what I'm more interested in to explore. I'm hoping I can do it through my scholarship, and I would like to hear thoughts of our greatest scholars here. I have questions, I don't have the answers. And I think the person who's going to talk to after me, Dr. Shirvani, would be a great person to converse with on this, because of his expertise on an Iranian Velayat al-Faqih model, the guardianship of the jurist, which is often seen as successful or success or failure, depending on whom you ask, but it's seen as an attempt to define some of those relationships in institutional terms in a modern context. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Harun. Thank you for bringing in Halak's scholarship. And I think Halak's The Impossible State generated lots of scholarly interest, but it has done more disservice to this field than service by simply blocking the debate that should have happened, that what should be the contours of political governance within politically organized community, whatever you may call it, because Halak does not want to use the term state. So I think it was really more of a tragedy rather than a scholarly contribution. But we'll definitely talk about it in a bit. But let's move on to Dr. Ali Sherwani. First of all, I want to congratulate you on the publication of your book, Transnational Evaluation of Constitutions Through the Prism of Human Rights and International Law. That's been published this year by Springer. And I look forward to rereading this excellent book, which is based on empirical data as well as qualitative analysis. So as Harun has already mentioned, that you are our man who will tell us what should be the relationship between Sharia and the state, and specifically in reference to Iran, which has been grappling with this question for the past 4 decades.
Okay, great. First of all, I'm so glad that joined this panel and being with you, Professor Harun Rahimi, Professor Talib Muhammad, Professor Siaq, and you yourself, Professor Abbasi. I'm going to categorize the questions and the notes of this panel, and then I'm going to give you a sample and then answer in my ability or what I think. to these questions, to these categorized questions. The main questions that here I heard, and I want to define them, is that how do the Taliban state or the Taliban will go to define, first of all, the people, as we study the people in the constitutions, or the humankind or the human being in international law. What would be the definition of the people in the Taliban's form of constitution or form of their thinking? The second question is that how do they define the relations with other Muslims or other schools of Islam like Shia or other types of the Muslims in the world? How do they define their relations? And the other question is that who would be and how would be the head of the state of the Emirat or of the Islamic Republic or any kind of state that they are going to shape or they're going to form? And the next question is, who would be the head of government? The other questions that should be answered, that how do they pass the law? Who is the legislator? Are they going to use bicameralism or unicameralism in this way, or other types that they're going to mix or compose these two types of legislation? And the last but not the least, but not the last, is that how do they define the Islam, or how do they constitutionally design the institution for judicial review or for the Islamic review? Is it going to be a centralized institution like a constitutional court, or is it going to be a council like the Guardian Council in Iran? And one more is that how do they acquire the sovereignty or the authority after they control the whole country? Like, are they going to use the force, the military force, or are they going to use the modern one and raise a referendum and apply the result of the referendum or a standard referendum? Now I'm going to give an example and then answer these questions from my thoughts. As you see in the modern world, all the smartphones have a standard shape. They have a camera, they are touch, they are smart, and the shape doesn't differ from, for example, iPhone to the other branches like Samsung or Huawei or any other branches. In the same example, the shape of the government who raised from Afghanistan after Taliban should match the world, the standard of the international law. They should have a head of power, a head of state who can make decrees. They should have a head of government who is gonna deal with international relations and foreign relations. And they're gonna need institutions to pass laws, either compatible with Sharia or the new rules that they think it is Islamic. They're gonna need institutions to review the Islamic law or the compatibility of the new laws with what they think it is Islam. And to answer all of these questions, as we can see that Islamic Republic of Iran is a model of what we call Shia model of government, answer these questions in a very modern way. For example, for the people, the Constitution of Islamic Republic Iran defined the people as Ummah. So in this discourse, any Muslim in the world could be the Ummah. And there should be some conflicts. For example, if Taliban defined the people as the same Ummah, so this Ummah should be under the Islamic Republic of Iran rule or under the what we call the Taliban state. The other one is that, like, how do they define the head of the state? Who is the most powerful, or who is the first one, first official representative of the government? Is he going to be a faqih? Is he going to be a khalifa? Is he going to be a king? Whatever we title him, he should have some power, the same as other powers of the head of the state from for the neighbors like Pakistan, Iran, or India, or maybe China. And the next one is that, like, what we see in Iran, that we have a parliament which called Majlis. It is one institution, but we have several more institutions that they can pass laws, and maybe they are not in the constitution, but they established by decrees of the head of the state, who is Wali Faqih. So they can pass laws which don't go through the process, the democratic process that we understand, that there should be a debate, there should be publication of the discussions on the paper, the news, and then pass a law, and they give a time to that to be forced or be enforced. Are they going to use the model which we see in Iran? There is a parliament, one parliament, but there are several, or there are multiple legislatures that they can pass laws without going through the parliament. So what I understand is that the next model of the government, or the modern government of the Taliban or Afghanistan, depends on these questions. And as we see, the sample of Iran and the sample of smartphone that I already gave, this model, this shape won't be very different from what we see in Pakistan, or what we see in Iran, what we see in Islamic Republic of Iran, what we see in Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Whatever we name it, Emirat Islami or Kingdom of Afghanistan, whatever would be the title, the form, the shape would be the same as these two countries and the other neighbors around them. And they're gonna step, I think, after the Islamic Republic of Iran in most constitutional institutions. I give the floor to you, Dr. Abbasi, and we can go for more questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we were able to complete our pitches within the time that we had planned. So now we open the floor for discussions. So many people are asking us so many questions. Sayed Shah is asking that the definition of the Ummah as per the Constitution of Medina was inclusive of non-Muslims as well. Do you see this liberal understanding come to in the future under the come to Bayah in the future under the Taliban rule in Afghanistan? So Ali Sherwani, would you like to answer this question?
The definition of the Ummah in Islamic Republic of Iran Constitution is any person within the Iran border or outside the Iran border who is a Muslim, or maybe who is a Shia Muslim. We can call that Ummah. That's what we understand from the discourse, from the constitutional discourse of Islamic Republic of Iran Constitution.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And this question, maybe Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed would like to answer. And the question is, how much would you credit the earlier Taliban takeover and rule to their immaturity to govern, since they were simply resistance fighters and had very little experience running an entire country? So the presumption here is that these are refined, maybe a better version of, just like maybe iPhone 12 of Taliban.
No, I don't think there is much difference. We can argue that this is a force which has like really re-emerged on the scene after 20 years of war, and this time with the Americans. But I think it's the Taliban movement is the same Taliban movement. They have a firm belief in something, and they would like to, fashion political institutions and state policies according to that belief system. For now, maybe we will hear this, inclusiveness or some opportunist Afghan leaders who are negotiating, power, sharing of power with the Taliban. But you will see, 31st August is not that far away. And then, that will, once the Americans are gone and the foreign troops are gone, then obviously the situation is very different. And the ability of the non-Taliban leaders who have been in government or on the power scene for the past several years, and in Hikmat Yar's case, right since the start of the Afghan jihad, even before that, 40 plus years, 50 years, half a century. So we'll see, this power sharing formula, how long does it work? And obviously, there were mistakes made by the Taliban regime in the past. There were, some divisions as well, especially in terms of dealing with the Al-Qaeda issue prior to 9/11. But again, as I made a point, that this is basically a political, religious movement rooted in bigotry. And obviously, that is their key source of legitimacy in the eyes of the Afghan people or those who support them. And somewhere down the lane, once they wield greater power and they have greater sources of revenue as well, sustaining the political order, we'll see, what happens then. Because there are many variables right now. It's situation is very fluid, and I wish that this regime, whatever the nature, if they're able to hodgepodge of Afghan leaders plus led by a majority Taliban, that it is not ostracized, and it is not like, because the Americans still have control over the global purse. So we may discover the Afghan people first and foremost, and nations living around Afghanistan, that if they are again squeezed, then obviously there are other forces which come into the play. And as for including the word ummah as like in the constitution, well, it was fine for Vilayat-e Faqih or the Iranian Revolution, because then obviously the Shias living around the world can be part of that ummah. But ummah in Taliban's case, because it defies the principle, whatever guarantee they have given it to the Americans in that accord, that they will not let Afghan soil be used by Muslims from other regions of the world, be they part of Al Qaeda or so. One wishes that a viable political settlement takes place, and regional countries, and especially powers which have aspirations of becoming great in this particular part of Asia, they should engage these people in meaningful ways, and there are incentives and disincentives for them not to play the same deadly game as they did with the Afghan people back in the 1990s. We know that very well. And this time the difference is that they are in occupation of almost entire Afghanistan, and there might not be any civil war right now. And this may be a great opportunity. And I think the world needs to engage them and constrain them right away in such a manner that we should not have the repeat of the past.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Dr. Ishtiaq. Mufti Mahir Jamil is joining us. We had a bit of technical problem that he could not join us. But before we proceed with further questions, I would request Mufti Mahir Jamil to provide his perspective in 5 to 7 minutes. Welcome, Mufti Mahir Jamil sir.
जी थैंक यू सर। जी सर, मैं वक्त के हवाले से कुछ गलती थी जिसकी वजह से मैं ज्वाइन नहीं कर सका।
Mahir sir, would it be possible for you to speak in English? But because we have two foreign scholars with us also. But if you're comfortable in speaking in Urdu, perfectly fine.
I think sir I am comfortable in Urdu. That's why I will.
Okay. I'll
proceed in-
then summarize whatever you said for our foreign scholars. Yeah, please proceed.
या जहाँ तक सर हमारा आज का मौजू है, तो आज के मौजू में के इब्तिदा से मैं सिर्फ ये अर्ज करूँगा कि क्या ताकत के बलबूते पर अपनी मर्जी की हुकूमत कायम की जाए, या जो लोग जो लोग वहाँ हुकूमत कायम करना चाह रहे हैं उनको सुधार दिया जाए, उनको समझाया जाए और वो उन्हीं उसूलों को अप्लाई करे जिसकी बुनियाद पर वहाँ एक पुरअमन हुकूमत कायम की जा सके। तो 1978 के बाद से जो हिस्ट्री है वो हमें ये बताती है कि दुनिया के दो सुपर पावर ने ताकत और असलहे के बलबूते पर अपनी मर्जी की हुकूमत कायम करना चाहिए, लेकिन जो उसके नताइज थे वो मुकम्मल तौर पर जो है वो उसमें नाकाम रही और उसमें लाखों लोग जो है वो लुक़्मा अजल बने। तो उसके बाद ये नतीजा बिल्कुल वाज़े तौर पर हमें ये समझ आता है कि हम बजाय इसके कि ताकत के बलबूते पर जो है वो हम कुछ करें, तो जो वहाँ के मकामी जितने भी स्टेक होल्डर हैं उनकी मर्जी से जो भी निज़ाम वो अपने मुल्क के लिए बेहतर समझते हैं उसको कायम करें। अगर वो ये समझते हैं कि इस्लाम का जो निज़ाम है वो हमारे इस रियासत के लिए, इस मुल्क के लिए, इस यहाँ के अवाम के लिए बेहतर है, तो ये उनका हक है और हर मुल्क के शहरियों का ये हक है कि वो अपने लिए कोई भी निज़ाम जो है वो इख्तियार करें और उस निज़ाम के तहत वो ज़िंदगी गुजारें। क्योंकि अफ़गानिस्तान में जो मौजूदा तालिबान है, वो उनका ये दावा है कि वो इस्लामी निज़ाम को कायम करना चाह रहे हैं। अगरचे माज़ी में जो उनकी तारीख़ है, जो हमारा तजुर्बा है वो बड़ा तल्ख़ है। उसकी वजह ये है कि माज़ी में ये हम कह सकते हैं कि बहुत सारी इस्लामी उसूल थे कि उनको नहीं अपनाया गया और एक कल्चर को, पश्तून कल्चर को और एक तआस्सुब की फ़िज़ा थी और उसके बहुत नुकसानात उन्होंने भी देखे और इसकी वजह से एक बदनामी भी हुई, क्योंकि लोग समझते हैं कि इस्लामी हुकूमत हो। तो इसलिए मैं इस्लामी हुकूमत के चंद बुनियादी उसूल की वज़ाहत करूँगा और इस्लामी निज़ामी हुकूमत में कोई ख़राबी नहीं है। ख़राबी हमारे अंदर हो सकती है कि हम उसको सही तौर पर जो है हम उस पर अमल नहीं कर सकते। इस बारे में सिर्फ़ इस बात को एक बुनियादी तसव्वुर हम में से हर एक के लिए वाज़ेह होना चाहिए। इस्लाम ने इस हवाले से कोई वाज़ेह तरीक़ा रियासत के लिए नहीं दिया है, बल्कि इस्लाम ने जिस तरह बका इबादत के अहकाम बतलाए हैं, ऐसे ही रियासत के लिए बड़े उसूल बतलाए हैं। इस्लाम ने इस बात को नहीं बतलाया है कि स्पेसिफिकली आपने कोई पार्लिमानी निज़ाम कायम करना है, कोई आपने सदारती निज़ाम कायम करना है, आपकी मुक़न्निना और अदलिया और आपकी इंतज़ामिया ये एक हो या अलग-अलग हो, कितने सूबे हो, ये इस किस्म की जो चीज़ें हैं, इस्लाम ने जो भी रियासत है, हुक्मरान है, उनको खुल्लम-खुला इख्तियार दिया है कि वो ज़मीनी हक़ाइक़ की रोशनी में और तजुर्बात की रोशनी में कोई भी जायज़ ढांचा जो है वो बना सकते हैं। अलबत्ता जो इस्लामी उसूल है, उन उसूल की अगर रियायत रखी जाए, तो वो وہ پھر ایک اسلامی حکومت جو ہے اس کو ہم کہہ سکیں گے. اس میں اس کا ایک سب سے بڑا اصول یہ ہے کہ اللہ تعالیٰ کی حاکمیت قائم کی جائے. مطلب یہ ہے کہ جو بھی قانون وہ قرآن و سنت کے مطابق بنے، اور بجائے یہ کہ جس طرح ہمارے جمہوری نظام میں فرد کی آزادی ہے کہ افراد جو نظام چاہتے ہیں، جو قانون اپنے نمائندہ کے ذریعے وہ پاس کرنا چاہتا ہے، چاہے وہ قانون کسی بھی مذہب کے مطابق ہو یا نہ ہو، اس چیز کا خیال نہیں رکھا جاتا. اسلام میں یہ واضح اصول ہے کہ آپ ضرور آئین بنائیں، لیکن اس آئین اور قانون بنائیں، لیکن آئین اور قانون کے اوپر جو حاکمیت وہ صرف اللہ تعالیٰ کی ہو. اس کا مطلب یہ ہے کہ کوئی بھی قانون قرآن و سنت کے خلاف نہ بنے. یہ ایک بنیادی اصول ہے اس کے. دوسرے جو اسلامی نظام حکومت کے اصول عدل و انصاف کا قیام ہے. عدل و انصاف یہ کسی بھی ریاست کے لیے ضروری ہے، اور اسلام کی تاریخ کا جب ہم مطالعہ کرتے ہیں تو عدل و انصاف کے رہنما اصول ہمیں ملتے ہیں. عدل و انصاف کے بارے میں حضور اقدس صلی اللہ علیہ وسلم نے ایک موقع پر فرمایا کہ اگر فاطمہ بنت محمد بھی چوری کرتی تو ان کو بھی یہ سزا دی جاتی جو سزا ایک عام خاتون کو دی جا رہی. اور آپ نے فرمایا کہ بڑی قومیں اس لیے ذلیل ہوئی کہ قانون کے لیے کمزور کے لیے الگ قانون اور امیر کے لیے الگ قانون ہوتا تھا. اور ہم جب خلفائے راشدین کی زندگی کا مطالعہ کرتے ہیں، حضرت علی رضی اللہ عنہ نے عدل و انصاف کے تقاضوں کو پورا کیا. قاضی شریح کے فیصلے کو انہوں نے یہودی کے مقابلے میں اس فیصلے کو مانا. دوسرا جو ایک اہم اصول ہے وہ ہے کہ وہ جو بنیادی سہولت ہے اس اپنے رعایا کو اس کی فراہمی کرے، جس میں خوراک ہے، جس میں رہائش ہے، جس میں ہیلتھ کا سسٹم ہے، جس میں ایجوکیشن کا نظام ہے. تو اس نظام کو قائم کیا جائے. پھر ایجوکیشن میں جتنی بھی ہماری عصری تعلیم ہے یہ اسلام کے بالکل بھی مخالف نہیں ہے. ان تمام تعلیمات کو بہترین سے بہترین انداز میں قائم کیا جا سکتا ہے. اسلام میں بچوں کی تعلیم ہو، بچیوں کی تعلیم ہو، خواتین کی تعلیم ہو، کالجز ہو، یونیورسٹیز ہو، اس کے اوپر اسلام نے کوئی پابندی نہیں لگائی. البتہ آپ ماحول کے اوپر بات کر سکتے ہیں کہ وہاں انوائرمنٹ کیسا ہونا چاہیے، سلیبس میں کیا چیزیں ہونی چاہیے، کیا چیزیں نہیں ہونی چاہیے. اس کے اوپر آپ بات کی جا سکتی ہے، اور اس بارے میں جو اسلامی احکامات ہیں ان کو مد نظر رکھا جا سکتا ہے. امن اور تحفظ اپنی رعایا کے لیے یہ بھی ایک بہت بڑا اصول ہے اسلامی ریاست کی کہ وہ اپنے شہریوں کو تحفظ جو ہے وہ دے. ایک اور اہم اصول وہ ہے امر بالمعروف و نہی عن المنکر، جس کو ہم کہتے ہیں قوانین اور اس پر عمل درآمد. اور یہ بھی ظاہر سی بات ہے، رول آف لا یہ کسی بھی ریاست کے لیے ضروری ہے. اس ریاست میں رول آف لا نہ ہو تو وہاں پر جو ہے وہ پھر اندھیر نگری ہوتی ہے، اور کسی بھی ظالم کے لیے اس میں پھر کوئی اس کو روکنے والا نہیں ہوتا. ایک اہم اصول اسلامی نظامی حکومت میں یہ بھی ہے کہ اسلام نے اپنی کمزور طبقات، خصوصاً جو اقلیتیں ہیں، اس کے خصوصی احکامات ارشاد فرمائے ہیں. حضور اقدس صلی اللہ علیہ وسلم نے یہاں تک فرمایا کہ جو کسی بلا وجہ کسی غیر مسلم شہری کو کوئی تکلیف دے، کوئی نقصان پہنچائے، تو قیامت کے دن میں اس کے خلاف خصم بنوں گا، میں اس بندے کے خلاف لڑوں گا کہ اس نے کیوں ایک غیر مسلم شہری کو اس نے اپنے ملک میں جو ہے وہ اس نے اس کے ساتھ ظلم کیا. اس طرح آگے پھر مزید اصول میں اسلام میں جو آئیڈیل نظام ہے وہ خلافت کا نظام ہے کہ خلیفہ ہو اور شورا ہو، اور شورا ہی کے ذریعے اس خلیفہ کا تقرر ہو. اور خلیفہ کیسا ہو، اس کے کیا اصول ہو، اس میں اسلام نے واضح اصول بتلائے ہیں کہ وہ عاقل ہو، بالغ ہو، مسلمان ہو، مرد ہو، اس کے پاس علم ہو، کردار اس کا بڑا واضح ہو، اور جو بھی وہ بادشاہ کی طرح اس کے پاس مطلق العنان اختیارات نہ ہو، بلکہ وہ اپنے تمام تر اختیارات کو شورا کی جو اختیارات ہے، شورا کے مشور ہے، اس کے مطابق وہ استعمال کریں. اور پھر اس کا حکومت سازی کا ڈھانچہ کیا ہو، جس طرح میں نے شروع میں عرض کر دیا کہ شورا کے پاس کیا اختیار ہونا چاہیے، کیا گورنر کیا اس کے پاس اختیارات کی تقسیم کیسی ہونی چاہیے، दिफा का निज़ाम और ये सारी इस किस्म की जितनी भी हुकूमती शोबे हैं, इस्लाम ने उस हवाले से कोई पाबंदी नहीं लगाई, बल्कि रियासत को मुकम्मल इख्तियार दिया है कि वो अपनी रियासत और रियाया के बेहतर मफाद में बेहतर से बेहतरीन निज़ाम तजवीज़ दें। तो ये कुछ बुनियादी उसूल थे जो कि मैंने आपके सामने रखे।
Thank you very much, Mahir Saab. So, to sum up what Mufti Mahir said, he said that Islam provides general principles and acknowledge right to self-determination. And one of the some of the key principles that lie at the heart of Islamic political governance, they are principle of justice, welfare, uh, education, which include women's education, safety and security, and protection of the weak, which include minorities. And it must be based on principle of consultation. So I know some of our panelists want to leave. So we have this question I want to ask. This is question from Dr. Sherwani to Professor Rahimi. Taliban's ability to control overall in Afghanistan, internal branches and provincial areas of Afghanistan. So Professor Harun, would you like to comment that? Yes, Taliban have taken over, but can they just stabilize it? Can they provide a stable government?
That is the question that remains to be seen. Really, no one has the answer for it yet. Some parts of the countries have stabilized in a sense that there is no fighting going on. In terms of whether people's livelihood can go back to normal, people will be able to continue to work, make a living, and continue with all the things that they were going to do with regard to education and start a business. Those are open questions. In some parts of the country, there's actual unrest going on. Kabul hasn't fully stabilized yet. There are bad actors exploiting the power struggles that are going on in Kabul. Panjshir remains a holdout for now. So, I mean, it depends what you mean by stabilizing the country. It goes back to this idea of rule of law, because sometimes Taliban portray themselves as a group of law and order. Something they can do very well. If you're an organized militia and you have no hesitation in terms of using violence, you can scare people into obedience. I mean, getting obedience from the population is not very difficult if you are an organized militia. But if you are trying to stimulate an economy, have a growing education sector that would produce skilled workers, if you want to have like robust humanities department where knowledge can be produced and can explore, if you want to have culture basically where like different forms of expressions are happening, those take more than just violence and obedience. That requires rule of law. That requires people to feel safe in terms of their personal safety, their property, their honor, and feel like any decisions that will affect them will be subject to some procedural safeguards. The idea of due process means that there's going to be no arbitrary force. So far, a person who looks like a Talib, often it's just not, they don't necessarily have uniform or like registration or anything. Anyone who looks like a Talib and holds a gun can do whatever they want with really no one having the ability to challenge them at the moment. So there is really no rule of law. I mean, there's no rule of law to speak of. And through this, they have been able to maybe impose law and order, meaning they have been able to stop people from fighting or challenge the rule. But will they be able to actually govern, meaning would able to stimulate an economy, have a growing education sector? Those would require a lot more. And they haven't done that. I mean, Taliban have been able to conduct a successful insurgency, but governing is a completely different kind of dynamic. It would require ruling through institutions, through procedures, due process, and many of the things that many of us come to expect from a normal nation state. Those things are lacking right now, and Taliban don't have a taste for it. I mean, you've seen some photos of people faces being blackened and like people being just running around in the streets as a deterrence against robbery. Okay, I mean, that may stop some people from committing robbery, but that also creates a general sense of unsafe. I mean, the fact that you can be subject to that kind of ridicule, even without due process, without trial, without any form of guarantees, also has a chilling effect on the population and what they can do. So it depends what you mean, and I don't have an indication so far will they be able to govern in that full sense of the word. We just have to see if they can transform their movements into a functioning state. I don't know.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So next question is from Professor Muhammad Taleb, where this whole issue of terrorism and Taliban's ostracization because they promote terrorism or have connections with ISIS has been raised. So what is your view on that, Professor Taleb, that this notion of terrorism and there's justification for war on terror?
Great question. I would say that these are labels that were used varyingly over decades. For example, jihad was kosher, halal in the eyes of global powers during the 1980s when they had to sort out the great game between Soviet Union and the rest of the world, I mean, rest of the global powers. And then in 1990s, there was a U-turn. I mean, and then terrorism, and if you look into the genealogy of these terms, current jihad, those were called mujahideen in 1980s, or terrorism. If you look into their genealogy and do a track on the line of time, then you would find that these are used according to the strategic preferences of those who consider Afghanistan to be their place. And so this is one. The other thing that worries me is that there's an impression given as if the birth of Taliban, both in the 90s and now, is imagined as if it was an unwanted birth, as if there was no thinking as to what is going to happen in Afghanistan. So I have deliberately used that word, and I wanted Zubair to smile.
Yes, Taliban is illegitimate children of imperialism. I love it.
I mean, as far as labeling is concerned, who Taliban are, I mean, I would like to also read Ishtiaq Saab's article on that. This is a great question, who are Taliban? But I just want to say that in the narrative, there is a kind of a spontaneous generation attributed to the coming up of Taliban, as if the international community is aghast as to where do you come from? You're not part of our bona fide list. Where are you from? And this tajahule arifana, this pretending to be ignorant, is contrary to the dense qualitative reports that intelligence agencies have about every nook and corner of Afghanistan. You just cannot be pretending that you don't know who they are. So that's one thing. The other thing is that this great game has to stop. And the trouble is that without this game stopping, the meaning of great game is that we generally talk about rule of law. You know, in great game, the rules are made during the course of the game, and they keep changing like chameleon. Theoretically, I don't even wish to transfer the great game to a small game. I would say that enough is enough, actually. 20 years, the question we are raising for Taliban, try using those questions for the global governance, security, and economic development in Afghanistan in the hands of the international community. Where was all that? I mean, the question that you've raised for Afghanistan, would you like to raise, for Taliban, would you like to raise the same for the international community? And my answer is, sorry, 20 years, trillion of dollars, and so much of investment in blood, for God's sake, is a bit like smashing a flask and picking up a fragment and then interrogating it as to why it doesn't behave like a normal flask. This is what we are doing to Afghanistan and to various institutions. So yeah, this is yeah.
Okay.
And also, sorry, there's one more thing, which is that the oldest weapon of combat or military tool is solidarity. It has been used, not every country has the privilege of having a standing army. And when, to avoid the repetition of Vietnam, jihad was basically the informal sector of war that was developed. And these mujahideen were nothing but the cutting edge in the informal sector of war, which was conscripted, which was adopted by those who have pretensions to secularism and world global peace. So I mean, I think let us have our concepts in order.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, Dr. Talib think that Taliban are the unwanted children. What do you think? Who are Taliban? And this is great to learn that you're a childhood friend of Mullah Umar.
No, come on. Who says so? I just went there to cover the emergence of a Mujahideen movement out of Mujahideen infighting back in the early 90s. That was it. So I was just performing an official journalistic assignment at that time. So, but I think there is a lot of deep philosophical talk in today's session, especially Ghalib Saab, has really brought forth so many issues to really reflect upon. And I think, my worry, let me just share my worry. We are just sitting, next to Afghanistan. And again, sometimes it seems that we are back in 1994. Then again, people have to specialize, on the conflict, another conflict in Afghanistan, this time with a different angle, the powers, which had abandoned Afghanistan in late 80s, after 9/11, they came back and they have been routed completely. The Europeans alongside the Americans, because the Europeans also must be asking themselves now as to if the Americans have brought shame to themselves, where are they? Should they be partnering with America in another global venture, in the name of freedom, democracy, and human rights? That's the big question. There are many things that we don't know, simply speaking. What happened behind the scenes at one level, last 20 years, Abbasi Saab, has also been a shadow war. It's if the violence has shifted to non-state actors, so there are then within the state apparatus, there are intelligence agencies which are also invisible. Non-state actors were also not visible soldiers. So what we have seen unfolding right before our eyes is there are many things that we don't know. And many things, happen beyond the normal diplomatic, channels that we have an understanding, traditional understanding of IR or political science. So my hunch now is, what transpired, how Taliban so quickly were able to capture one city after another and enter Kabul. Even myself, I think a month ago, or everybody else, I think mostly, I just predicted that there will be a spring offensive. Like the snow will come, violence will recede. Perhaps after the spring offensive, next year the Taliban will be able to reconquer Kabul. That was my own assessment. And I think this assessment is shared by many. So our journalistic colleague, of the olden times, now we were in another German sponsored gathering this afternoon, and he just revealed that, the Hamid Karzai and Abdullah basically were the two people who were calling every provincial governor, of the Afghan regime, the government, to lay down, to let Taliban, capture that province and move ahead. So there is a different levels of betrayals have taken place. As we speak now, we will know, the truth will come out eventually. I just want to share, because Ghalib Saab's discourse, I would like to build upon that. I think that Pakistan, along with other regional countries, especially countries in the Muslim world as well, China, Russia, Central Asian states, Iran, I think it's very important right now not to isolate the next regime that is coming in Afghanistan. Whether we like it or not, you have to deal with it. This is a state of affairs that the Americans are leaving behind. On the 31st, probably Americans will leave behind the Afghans, queuing up outside the airport. And just as you saw the American Chinooks and Black Hawk, taking the diplomats and staff and embassy right on 15th of August, and then subsequently, taking these Afghan interpreters and others who sided with them, and with hiring signs, that we saw, even a member of the football team dropping, from the sky. So maybe 31st will be another episode, because these guys, tens of thousands who are outside, will be abandoned in the end. So one argument which is really realistic argument, and which is a Darwinistic argument, which is that Biden actually is a smart player. He's putting an end, morals aside, he's leaving. And this would give America the opportunity to refocus its energy on other, bigger issues. They will have a bigger time, money, and attention to focus on the great game that they are trying to, wage in future. America remains the most powerful country, at least in our time. They have a control over economic resources, technology, brain, many things that the Chinese may not have. So my hunch, again, coming back to the central point which I'm trying to raise, that if, this entire war infrastructure, with Taliban controlling the entire Afghanistan, and perhaps, this Panjshir Valley might also fall, in a few days, or maybe there will be an agreement, because after 31st August, Taliban confidence will increase further, and the ability of Abdullah, or those who betrayed, are still in Kabul, and those who are trying to resist, I think the Taliban psychologically, physically, as well as psychologically, will have greater edge, and there will not be any Western, remaining some kind of a constraint. So time for us in Pakistan and those in the region, or including China, is running out. So some kind of a constitution, power sharing, government coming into power in Kabul, and region has to make sure that it survives. If it doesn't survive, if it is squeezed by the withdrawing European and American powers from this region, then obviously they will look for revenue somewhere else. And the price will be paid by Pakistan next door, by other regional countries, because when you look for the alternative source of revenue, there are plenty of non-state actors, around the world, which are willing to buy some space and then engage. So Americans can calculate that if terrorism at all comes back, it might take another decade or 20 years to reach them. But in between, the life of the Afghans and the life of the people in the regional neighborhood, just you can imagine. And constraining China's rise, if we buy the conspiracy theory, which I don't buy, but things happen. Things happen in this part of the world. There are stories that we never know. And only we know when Kabul falls to the Taliban in 2 days, and when sometime in 4 years down the lane that the Chinese will be, worrying about their westernmost, province of Xinjiang, then, if China is under pressure from this part of the world, although I don't believe the real thing that will take place is in the Indo-Asian Pacific region, as far as this emerging rivalry is concerned. But you never know that on this corner as well, the rise of China is constrained with this, monster that has started to take root once again in Afghanistan.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, for your insightful comments. Now I want to turn on to towards Dr. Sherwani. So, Dr. Sherwani, your country, Iran, was the first Muslim country ever to be governed and ruled by fuqaha, by jurists. And Taliban then went ahead. So they were not fuqaha, but the fuqaha students, right? So Talib, literally students. I mean, imagine if in France or Spain or other country, students might have taken over a country like they tried in Tiananmen Square. The whole world would be bustling and saying, "Hey, young people, taken over the country. Let's support them," right? But the difference is that these Taliban are students of madrasas, right? And one of the criticism behind Taliban is that they don't have ideology. So behind Iranian Islamic Republic, you had Vilayat Faqih. But Taliban, they don't have, like, their whole concept of imarat, it does not, they don't call themselves khilafat. And this is the question I'll be asking from Mufti Mahir Jamil in a minute. But what's your assessment? Do you think that some sort of Iranian model would be replicated in Afghanistan? Do you see it operating effectively?
I answer this question by going back to the sample that today's smartphone, doesn't matter it is iPhone or it's Android, they're gonna function in the international law area. So they need someone as a head of the state, they need someone as the head of the government, they need legislature. And even if they don't have the ideology, or even they don't have the Wali Faqih, but they need to put someone, they need to set someone as the head of the state to make the policies, or to make the decrees, or to dispute the powers. So I think it's gonna replicate like between Islamic Republic of Iran and Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and maybe use other different names or other different titles, but the function would be the same. The way of acquiring the power would be the same. And as you see that the fall of Kabul, if we want to say, in some way it seems as the day of the Revolutionary Guard, the day of the Iranian Revolution in February 1979, that Imam Khomeini came back, and it was like a victory. But Shah, or the king, went out of the country, like Ashraf Ghani went out of the country, and another one came back in, another head of state. At the time, he said that I will go to Qom and I don't be a prime minister, I won't be a president, I won't be, I won't have any title, and I won't interfere with the rulings and governing and the politicians. But in a few years later, or a few months later, Imam Khomeini was the head of the state, and was the person who had the power to decree, and was the person who had the point of judicial review. Even the Guardian Council were there. So I think the model for Taliban would be the same. Even they say that they don't have the ideology, but they're gonna drive their car in the same line and same lane of international law, and they should have a foreign minister. They should have foreign relations with their neighbors. They should have some institutions, some constitutional institutions. in the country to share the power, to rule. Whatever they say, it is rule of law or it is rule of Islam, it is by madrasa. The names, the titles doesn't matter. It would be the same.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Sharwani. And now we move on to Mufti Mahir Jamil साहब, आपसे पूछना चाहेंगे कि आपने मेंशन तो किया कि जनरल प्रिंसिपल इस्लाम ने प्रोवाइड किए हैं हुकूमत करने के, जिसमें अदल भी है, इंसाफ भी है, लेकिन मुफ्ती साहब इसमें जो बड़ा सवाल ये है कि इशू ये नहीं है कि शरीयत का नफाज किया जाए, इशू ये है कि अगर शरीयत में मुख्तलिफ आरा हैं तो फिर कौन सी राय जो है वो जो सुल्ता से या फोर्स से आप इन्फोर्स कर सकते हैं ना, इस्लाम का कौन सा वाला पार्ट जो है वो आप जो स्टेट नाफिज करेगी, तो उस हवाले से शरीयत हमें क्या बताती है?
जी, इस्लाम में कुछ चीज़ें ऐसी हैं जिस पर सबका इत्तेफाक है, जिस तरह कुरान और सुन्नत के ऐसे बहुत से अहकामात हैं जिसमें किसी फ़क़ीह का कोई इख्तिलाफ नहीं है। कुछ मेजर बड़ी चीज़ें हैं जिसका पता है कि ये चीज़ें हराम हैं। इसके अलावा और बहुत सारे ऐसे मसाइल और अहकामात हैं जिन मसाइल और अहकामात के बारे में इख्तिलाफ राय है। लेकिन इस हवाले से इस्लाम ने जो भी मजलिस शूरा, जो कि आजकल पार्लियामेंट है, जो लेजिस्लेटर है, जो लेजिस्लेशन करते हैं, या जो अदलिया है जिन्होंने कानून की तशरीह करनी है, इस्लाम ने उनको मुकम्मल इख्तियार दिया है कि वो कुरान और सुन्नत, ज़मीनी हक़ाइक़ की रोशनी में और जितनी भी हमारी तशरीहात है चारों आइम्मा की, उसकी रोशनी में कोई भी काबिल अमल रास्ता बना दें तो वही जो है वो सबके लिए दुरुस्त होगा। जिस तरह एक उसूल है कि हुक्म हाकिम जो होता है वो राफिल अल खिलाफ होता है, कि जो पहले का इख्तिलाफ होता है उसमें अगर रियासत किसी एक रास्ते को मुंतखब करेगी तो वही रास्ता हर मकतब फ़िक्र और हर मसलक वाले के लिए वही रास्ता फिर दुरुस्त
मुफ्ती
रास्ता
साहब बहुत
कहलाएगा।
शुक्रिया। उसमें मुझे ये बताइए कि जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में एक सबसे बड़ा इशू ये होता है कि
जी सर,
आप जिसको आपने अख्तियार दे दिया, आपने पावर दे दी कि ठीक है, वो
जी
आपने
सर,
हाकिम को दे दिया कि हाकिम राफिउल निज़ा होगा, लेकिन हाकिम की
जी सर,
हुकूमत, हाकिम के अख्तियार के ऊपर हम कैसे रिस्ट्रिक्शंस रखेंगे? अब देखिए कि अगर हाकिम
जी,
जो है वो मुतलकुल अनान हुक्मरान बनना चाहता है, ठीक है, कि जैसे खिलाफत जो है वो मलूकियत अगर बन जाए, तो हम उसको, शरीयत
जी
हमें
सर।
क्या बताती है कि हम उसको कैसे रोकेंगे?
सर इसमें सबसे पहली बात तो ये है कि हाकिम जो इसमें है खिलाफत के निज़ाम में, इसमें शूरा की जो बात है उसको मुकम्मल शरीयत ने शूरा को इख्तियार दिया है कि उनकी राय को लिया जाएगा। उसमें ये नहीं है कि इमाम की राय ही को जो है हतमी राय समझा जाए,
लेकिन
बल्कि
मुफ्ती
शूरा
साहब
में जो अक्सर
एक मिनट मैं आपको
जी,
यहाँ पे
जी,
इंटरप्ट करूंगा कि शूरा
जी,
जो है क्या वो बाइंडिंग है इमाम
जी,
के ऊपर, या इमाम जो है वो खुद ही, जैसे कि हजरत अबू बकर सिद्दीक रज़ियल्लाहु अन्हु ने कहा कि नहीं, मैंने जो है मानी ने ज़कात से ज़कात लेनी है, ठीक है, आप शूरा में आप हमें अबू बकर सिद्दीक रज़ियल्लाहु अन्हु, हजरत अली रज़ियल्लाहु अन्हु कह रहे हैं कि जी नहीं, मसलहत को आप अख्तियार कर लें, लेकिन हजरत अबू बकर रज़ियल्लाहु अन्हु ने कहा कि जी नहीं, क्योंकि कुरान में लिखा है तो मैं मानी ने ज़कात के अगेंस्ट में जाऊंगा। तो फिर जो हुक्मरान और शूरा का जो आपस में ताल्लुक है, अगर आप मॉडर्न कॉन्सेप्ट में देखें कि पार्लियामेंट है और दूसरी तरफ जो है वो प्रेसिडेंट है, राइट, तो उनका आपस में जो ताल्लुकात होंगे वो कैसे, उस बारे में हमें शरीयत क्या आगाही हमें फराहम करती है?
उसमें 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 जो इसमें ये इस बात को ज़्यादा तरजीह दी गई कि शूरा का इख्तियार इमाम के इख्तियार से ज़्यादा होगा। मसलन अगर शूरा एक चीज़ पर फैसला करती है, तो इमाम उसकी मुखालफत नहीं कर सकता। और इस बारे में हमें ऐसी रिवायात भी मिलती है, वशाविरहुम फिल अम्र फ़इज़ा अज़म्त फ़तवक्कल अला अल्लाह। ये कुरान मजीद की आयत है। इसकी तशरीह में यही मुफस्सिरीन ने लिखा है कि अगर शूरा किसी चीज़ को मुंतखब करती है, तो उस मुंतखब करदा के नतीजे में जो है इमाम उसकी मुखालफत नहीं कर सकता।
ठीक है, बहुत शुक्रिया। सो तालिब साहब आपकी तरफ आएंगे, कोई अगर आप कंक्लूडिंग कमेंट्स देना चाहें अपनी इस आज की टॉक के हवाले से? Talib Sahab, are you with us? Okay, I think this is opportune time that I should thank all the participants.
Sorry.
Talib Sahab, जी आपको
Sorry,
concluding
Dr. Saab.
remarks देना चाहेंगे?
Just to quickly say that there are so many attempts on the part of neighboring countries to imagine Afghanistan and connect to them, not in the spirit of great game. Long back in early 90s, there was this Peshawar Accord. There were other consensus building exercises that were just thrown out of the window because of because the great game had to take another route, so to say. So it is very important. I suppose that the neighboring countries, and I include Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, even perhaps Turkey, to be part of not the great game, but perhaps a kind of an international relation approach in the spirit of very genuine support to development, security, and economic development. Yeah, without which I can't imagine anything really happening. All these questions of law and what should be its color and costume, that really depends much on what is the wider framework, you know, of a typical nation, a country that needs health, that needs you know, some grounding beneath the feet.
Thank you very much. With this, I thank Dr. Sherwani, Dr. Muhammad Talib, Dr. Harun Rahimi, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, Mufti Mahir for providing us their insights. And with this, we end the session.